So I just wanted to make this video. I was going to respond to Dan McClellan and some other secularists that I was listening to, right? But I was like, okay, but it can be maybe in this format where I'm just going to address their secular frame or something, when they rely on, because Dan made another video on America is still not a Christian nation, but he was addressing Mario, what's his name, Milo Yiannopoulos or whatever. But I think Milo is a Catholic or so. And then Dan appeals to the Treaty of Tripoli again, or like some of his commentators. But that doesn't work, right? As far as when it comes to a dissenting Christian nation, a dissenting Lockean Christian nation, right? Because that kind of nation, because a nation is like a people with culture and a religion, right? Or a religious people, and their culture is tied to that. And so those are still Christian people, so that still counts as a Christian nation. And so they don't depend on magisterial imperial churches, union with church and state on national level, right? And so the Treaty of Tripoli makes sense from a dissenting Christian point of view, that it can be accounted for just like the separation principle can be accounted for. And so what's other things like separation of powers and even the secular values, the liberal values, right? I believe all of it can be accounted for. It requires the right interpretive frame. I did try to expand on this before in my old video on I called it the American covenantal frame, the biblical consciousness of America, basically. But I was relying more on the books that I have, which is okay, right? But don't think I kind of like articulated it all that well. So I'm hoping to use ChatGPT to maybe like do a better job of structuring stuff, and it has been very helpful, right? Like when I started off, it was like, what was it? ChatGPT was like, yeah, it's plausible what I'm going for, right? So over some hours, now it's more airtight. So it's more like confident that yeah, this is historical and theologically, historical, like as far as America's history, that it still is grounded in reality, basically. That it's not just some, fantasy or something, right? So it's more than plausible. And now ChatGPT is, right? So if I did try to get it to be accurate, if it quotes anything or whatever, right? Don't want it making up anything. So I did give it some books that I know, that I've read. Try to source some things, right? But I do apologize if it's inaccurate or whatever, and you don't have to agree. I'm just trying to help Christians understand, like, you're kind of lacking a frame to how to interpret the country through the biblical consciousness, but it only works if you interpret it in a distinct way within the liberal secular, values. So you cannot just cut those off, because I know theocrats want to do that, and just like the anti-Christian liberal wants to cut Christian religion, Christianity, entirely from the republic, right? Just reduce it to another religion among other religions. And so America's God, like what it says in the Declaration, the Creator God and all that, just gets reduced to just being a generic God where everyone can just presuppose their God is the American God, right? And I'm like, that's not true. There's only one God for America, right? And it's the God of all creation. That is the way that the founders thought when it came to certain unalienable rights, right? And those are to be seen as real. Because people who believe in God, we believe God is real, therefore those things are real, like natural rights and all that. They're not human constructs in your mind, because it causes a lot of problems, because then you have to say that, well, all this stuff is imaginary, right? Which I think is dangerous, because I see a lot of these secularists argue this way, and they think that this is reasonable, and it's actually not, because of their strict empiricism, right? I think that's what it's called, when they're verifying proofs to your senses or so. A very strict empiricism that I don't think is rational. And so it cannot reflect the rationalism of the founding, right? So I wanted to just go over what I came up with, right, with ChatGPT. And so here I start with the America's founding, a Christian and biblical moral order. America's founding was not the product of secularism, deism, or philosophical rationalism. It arose from a dissenting Protestant conscience, shaped by Lockean Christianity and a biblical covenantal worldview. From the Revolutionary War to the Declaration of Independence and the Constitutional Convention, the founders believed that liberty, conscience, and justice flowed from the moral order revealed in Scripture and sustained by divine providence. The dissenting Christian conscience and the Presbyterian Rebellion. The American Revolution was called the Presbyterian Rebellion by the British, and for good reason. Dissenting Protestants, Presbyterians, Congregationalists, Baptists, and others led the moral charge for independence, teaching that freedom was a sacred duty under God. Their theology came from the Reformation's defense of liberty of conscience, the belief that every person answers first to God and not to human rulers. Preachers across the colonies invoked Acts 5:29, saying we must obey God rather than men. This dissenting conscience not only inspired political liberty, but also grounded the principles of separation of church and state. Dissenting Christians argued that civil authority should not dictate conscience or faith, while also affirming that government must operate under God's moral law. In other words, the separation of church and state in America emerges from Christian dissenting principles, not secular or deistic abstractions. This conviction made political liberty a moral necessity. From pulpits across America, ministers proclaimed that resisting tyranny was obedience to God. These sermons shaped a biblical conscience in the people, one that viewed political rebellion not as lawlessness but as covenantal faithfulness. Sermons and the biblical frame of the Revolution. The Revolution was in essence a pulpit-born movement. Colonial pastors preached from Exodus, the prophets, and the New Testament, portraying Britain's king as Pharaoh and America as a new Israel. Verses like Galatians 5:1, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ has made us free, end quote, and then appeared constantly in sermons and pamphlets. And these political sermons did not secularize the gospel. They applied biblical morality to civil life. Liberty was understood as the political expression of the Christian soul, the freedom to obey God with a clear conscience. Thus, the revolution was not a revolt against order, but a restoration of divine justice rooted in covenantal faith. Of course, I could utilize much better quotes, but I think these ones suffice to kind of get the point across of what I'm going for. So continuing, the Declaration of Independence and Lockean Christianity. The Declaration of Independence embodied the moral reasoning of Lockean Christianity, a synthesis of reason, revelation, and covenantal theology. Locke's defense of natural rights rested on Genesis 1:26-27, which declares that humanity was made in the image of God. When Jefferson wrote that humans are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, he framed this within what he described as the American mind, a moral political consciousness shaped by colonial experience, Protestant ethics, and Enlightenment reason. Jefferson's formulation presupposes what John Adams explicitly stated, that the general principles on which the fathers achieved independence were the general principles of Christianity. In other words, the Declaration, America's mind, did not emerge in a secular or neutral vacuum. It was grounded in Christian moral principles, particularly the belief in the dignity of the individual, the moral law of God, and covenantal obligations. Jefferson's abstract language about unalienable rights is therefore not a departure from Christianity, but its expression in the political discourse of the American people. His appeal to a supreme judge of the world, Psalm 7:11, and divine providence, Psalm 91, further underscores that the Declaration's theism was biblically rooted and moral, not merely deistic or deistic. Lockean Christianity as polemical against deism, rationalism, and secularism. John Locke's deism was Protestant. Locke's from 1632 through 1704 was a committed Protestant. His two treatises of the government presupposes a single providential God, the same God worshipped by Christians. He grounded natural law and rights in God and this God's moral order. Locke's God is not an abstract deist clockmaker, but an active moral covenantal God who legislates justice and commands obedience. Lockean liberalism presupposes the God of the Bible, the one God, and Christian morality. This is two, right? Yeah, two, one God and Christian morality. Because Locke's liberalism rests on a single moral God, it aligns with Protestant Christianity. His political theory assumes moral duties grounded in God's law, making secularism, denying God, and deism, detached God, inconsistent with Lockean liberalism. Rights are non-abstract human inventions. They are God-given, echoing both Genesis 1:26 through 27 and the moral framework Adams calls the general principles of Christianity. 3. Rationalism is not enough. Philosophical rationalism by itself is neutral on moral law and does not presuppose the God of Scripture. By contrast, Locke's reason is subordinate to revelation. Reason discerns God's natural law, but it is God's character and covenant that ground justice and liberty. 4. Secularism fails as the Lockean test. Locke's framework makes moral and political order impossible without belief in God. Secularism, which removes God from moral law, is incompatible with the foundational assumptions of Lockean liberalism, and therefore with the moral reasoning behind the Declaration and Constitution. Implication for America. When Jefferson speaks of the American mind and Adams calls the founding principles the general principles of Christianity, they are practically applying Lockean Protestantism. Therefore, America's political philosophy is Christian in character, and because it presupposes the same God, Locke described a single providential moral God who ordains justice and human rights. Yeah, because America's religion, I want to add, is also distinctly Christian. It's not a generic religion or a generic monotheism. And continuing, the biblical influence on American symbols, the inscription on the Liberty Bell, proclaim liberty throughout all the land, unto all the inhabitants thereof. It's from Leviticus 25:10, links American freedom with the covenantal ethics of Israel. Benjamin Franklin and other founders proposed biblical imagery for the Great Seal, including the crossing of the Red Sea, highlighting the Exodus narrative as a metaphor for liberty. So that shows the biblical imagination or consciousness that they all, were in, right? That kind of frame of mind. I also want to add that before there was Christendom, right, or Christianity, there was always the Hebrew Bible, which was foundational to Western civilization as well, right? So continuing, the Constitutional Convention and Divine Providence. Benjamin Franklin urged, "Except the Lord build the house, they labor in vain that build it," which is from Psalm 127:1. Reflecting later, Franklin wrote, "I can hardly conceive a transaction of such momentous importance should be suffered to pass without being in some degree influenced, guided, and governed by that omnipotent and omnipresent and beneficent ruler, in whom all inferior spirits live and move and have their being," which is from Acts 17:28. James Madison also refers to the finger of the Almighty hand guiding the Constitution, right? Because they do not see it as a godless document, even without any mentioning of God, right? That does, what was the fallacy? Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, basically. It's possible that they still presuppose God and biblical consciousness. The biblical basis for separation of powers. The founder's system of checks and balances drew inspiration from Moses and Aaron. Moses governed civil law while Aaron served as high priest. Exodus 28, Numbers 18, Scripture Isaiah 33 through 22 guided the principle that no single human should wield unchecked authority. Because I know some people I want to add that because some secularists think that you cannot get the separation of powers from the Bible, and I'm like, that's not true. So I want to throw that in there. And so why secularism, deism, and rationalism fail, and also generic religion, is because secularism denies divine authority and the foundation of moral law, and deism was inconsistent and detached. Its God offered no covenantal accountability. Rationalism was a tool for understanding God's law, not a replacement for it. The American mind was scripture-informed, provident, trusting, and reasoned in faith, not generic or purely philosophical. The religious ethos of America, from the pulpit to the battlefield to the Constitution, America's story is one of Christian moral and biblical consciousness. The Revolution expressed covenantal liberty. The Declaration proclaimed Lockean Christianity. The Constitution embodied biblical order. Liberty, justice, and government in America were never generic monotheism. They were grounded in the Protestant Christian conscience and biblical moral order. So that was like the last part of it. I did have other forms of it that I could go over. Like in earlier versions, I had give an example of the division between theists, so to say, if you want to call Franklin a theist or so, because he was usually associated with like being a theist or something. But I used his rebuke of pain on his views on Christianity, like I put it here, right after James Madison. It says the father of the Constitution also wrote with the finger of that almighty hand guiding the document of the Constitution. And then I put, even Franklin, often labeled a theist, opposed Thomas Paine's attacks on Christianity. When he said, he who spits against the wind spits in his own face. If men are so wicked with religion, what would they be without it? Yeah, because that was in, when, I think it was one of the comments in their discourses, or no, I'm sorry, in their correspondence between Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Paine. And to me, that just sort of shows that if you're going to count them as theists, right, then they certainly were not unified on their on being against Christian values. How one favors Christianity and moral order, which is possible even with non-Christians who favor Christian values, in comparison to like those who are theists but don't they don't favor Christian values, right? And so even among the theists, they were split. And so just appealing to theism doesn't change anything, really. And so trying to look at all the earlier versions that I've had because I was going through this for a few hours or so. So anyway, I don't know if you like my videos, please like and subscribe, right? I think I'll stop there. But yeah, I could have used other quotes, right? I've used them before, like several other quotes that are like a lot better, I think, in my old video. Because I remember when I was trying to flesh out this idea, like this sort of American covenantal frame, this sort of like a biblical consciousness for the America, right? I think I used my books that I've read. Yeah, you can find like more better quotes that can actually like flesh out the idea. Like I do have them in the old videos and stuff, but anyway, I think like with ChatGPT's help, right, I think it did do a bit better job as far as structuring it, almost like an essay, or I changed it to be more like an apologetic kind of thing. So it's like, okay, so it was very helpful, it has some sources. I decided another version that had like sources from other stuff, but I think you get the idea, right? And so that's basically just utilized the thoughts or the idea that I got just contemplating with God on like America's Christian, but how is it Christian, right? So it requires a unique interpretation, like I said a while back, an appeal to God, right? And so I don't know if you don't have to agree if you don't want to, but I'm just saying that there is a basis for Christians to call these values Christian, because in the American mind and the American consciousness, they do have a distinct Christian character, and that you don't have to concede to these sort of anti-Christian liberals, right? All of these values. And so, anyway, if you like my videos, please like and subscribe. Thank you, and God bless.